Hello class, Professor Cook here. I'm back with part 2 of the audio and screen portion for chapter 9 on race and ethnicity. You'll notice if you watched part 1 that I've skipped over a few slides here. I still would like you to look at those and have that information be important for you as you read through the chapter, but I feel that parts of this lecture are more important for me to explain a little bit in detail. So that's what I'm going to focus on. So now I want to kind of move forward to looking at segregation and relations between historic relations between dominant and minority groups in the U.S. Mostly we're looking at a United States context, both historically and currently. That said, we will have a few references to these issues around the world. So let me go ahead and start with explaining these different kinds of segregation that we understand from a sociological perspective. So generally, segregation here refers to the physical and social separation of groups. So examples would be in the Jim Crow era South, people of African American identities having to go to separate schools, use separate hospitals, things that to us now just seem really extreme. So in sociology, we talk about de facto segregation, which is informal or by choice. You'll notice I put the word choice in quotations here because I want to recognize that that choice is shaped by structures, shaped by history, and by societal pressures here. So the video clip I'm referring to here is the clip that I posted in your D2L called Race, the House We Live In. And I want you to look at that and consider whether or not you see examples of, how you see examples of de jure, the second kind of segregation, which is formal and by law, affecting this other type of by choice. So de jure segregation is by law, and this was essentially started to erode or become illegal through Supreme Court decisions and through the Civil Rights Movement. So Brown versus the Board of Education is a notable case from 1954 that led to the desegregation of public schools. And the famous quote, "separate but equal," came out of that sort of case and that history. Okay, so de facto versus de jure segregation. What we have now in the United States is generally much more de facto or by choice, but of course, as I said, that's influenced by history and structures as well. The reason, so if you have not yet watched Race, the House We Live In, maybe go watch that quickly and then come back to this and then hold off on posting your answers to those questions until the end of the slides if you'd like. But part of the reason we talk about housing discrimination in this chapter is if you look at household income separated on average by race and ethnic group, and this is including both income earners in the household. So this would be, if it's a two income household, that would include both of those people. You see what we would call disparities, right? Differences based on race or ethnic group. So Asian Americans have the highest household income and African Americans have the lowest on average. And this slide is a bit dated. However, this has not changed. The numbers have changed, but the relative proportions to how much people are earning compared with one another has not changed. So I want you to think about how is this connected to the housing discrimination, okay? How is this connected to the video that you saw? When you think about the average American's assets, what you will note is that for most of us, the largest asset that we will ever have in terms of money is our home. Okay, so if our home is our largest asset, I want you to think about the power of that in terms of passing on wealth to our children. And consider how de jure segregation in the housing market after World War II led to this kind of disparate outcome, right? So I'll say more about that in a minute. if we consider dominant and minority group relations, we can consider them on this continuum or scale of more to less tolerance or extreme intolerance. So on the left, the most intolerant relation is genocide, where the dominant group tries to actively destroy minorities. So an example is American Indians, Native Americans, and how they were treated by European invaders in the United States. Segregation, just to the right of that, is physical and social separation of groups. Assimilation would be if the group is absorbed into a more dominant group. So you might think of assimilation in terms of the category of whiteness. Whiteness was not always understood in the same way that it is now. So people of Irish ancestry and some Italian ancestry and Eastern European ancestry with light-colored skin, we might categorize as white. But back in about 100 years ago, those individuals were not considered white in the same way as they are now. So the category of whiteness sort of expanded to include those individuals, and that's a little bit of an assimilation. And the racialization concept I mentioned in the last lecture portion. And then finally, on the far right, as most acceptance, we would have cultural pluralism, where there would be no dominant group because everyone shares power. Well, as you can imagine, this doesn't really exist in terms of straight shared power in the United States or in the world today. You've got dual language ability in Switzerland, maybe. You've got gender balance in some parts of Scandinavian countries. But what I like to ask sometimes as we go over this slide is, where do you think the United States is on this continuum now, currently? And most people sort of say that we're still between segregation and assimilation, right? We're not to pluralism, which is our ideal, hopefully. Okay, so this is a little mini quiz application. You can read through these, and then the answers are in the notes section of the slide. So I'll let you practice that on your own. I talked about racialization earlier in the previous set of lecture slides, so I want you to kind of consider that. But essentially, it's creating a new racial identity around a formerly unnoticed group of people. So categories like Asian American and Hispanic American or Latinx are composed of a lot of different ethnicities. And essentially what we've done in the United States is said, well, even though your geographic area of origin is incredibly diverse and different, we're going to kind of put all of you into this group, right? Based on somewhat arbitrary decisions. So European American would be another pan-ethnic, we sometimes call it pan, P-A-N, or broad ethnic category. And what we're noticing is that historically in this country, and you can look at some interviews between your author and these race scholars online if you'd like to look up Jennifer Lee's work. She's really noted scholar in this area. We have had race defined as a white and non-white, or black and non-black divide. And that's changing as we have folks from around the world, from parts of Asia, from Latin America, from other parts of the world, moving to the United States and settling here, immigrating. That is changing the understanding of race as sort of a white, non-white, or black, non-black divide. And as you saw in a previous slide, Asian Americans have higher household incomes on average than other racial ethnic groups. So the idea there is, eventually, would our understanding of white expand as it did to include people who are Jewish and people who are Irish? Will that eventually expand to include people of Hispanic identity or Asian identity? I don't know that it will. That's just sort of a question to consider, this concept. the importance of being white, what we're getting at here in this slide is the concept of white privilege. So I want to be clear that in order to experience racial privilege, you don't have to want that privilege. So it is just a product of the way our society has worked. Okay, so I am not suggesting that some people deserve privilege and some people don't. I'm not at all saying that, and I'm not saying, or sociologists are not saying, that all whites, for example, experience privilege equally. We know that there are lots of poor and economically oppressed people who identify as white. Okay, and that's not so. That's not to say that everyone experiences this. It's to say that your skin color does not create an oppression for you. So the concept that usually helps us understand this is from Peggy McIntosh, and so she called whiteness an invisible knapsack, or like a backpack of privileges that you get to carry around with you, that gives you somewhat of an advantage, even if you don't ask for that, just as racist structures put people who are not white or not read as white at a disadvantage. So we can also think about class privilege, educational privilege, religious privilege, gender privilege, gender identity privilege, and sexual orientation privilege in this context as well. So essentially, it's the idea that people treat you differently based on how they're reading your race. So if you're read as white, you're sort of assumed to be not committing a crime, you're assumed to be educated and wealthier. Whether that's true or not is a different matter, but if you look in the notes of this slide, you can see some examples of that white privilege. One that I think is really interesting to consider is if you go into a store and you are a person who is white, and you can shop without the security people looking at you or assuming you're stealing or shoplifting, that's a privilege, right? That other people of different racial identities don't have. Microaggressions is a related concept here, and I've got the picture of the meme of Obama and Biden, because I think it's really interesting. As close as these two were and as strong as their relationship was, Biden is not always the best at expressing himself, and unfortunately, in this example on the bottom of the slide, this is a quote from Biden about President Obama, or then Senator Obama, right? So this idea that he is, quote, the first mainstream African American who is articulate, bright, and clean, and a nice looking guy, from Biden, this is Biden's quote, suggests that Obama is the exception, right? And this is from Dr. Wing Su, who created this concept of microaggressions, right? He's the exception, and that is revealing. So microaggressions sort of reveal assumptions you have about groups. So what I sometimes ask students to consider is, have you ever had someone microaggress you, or have you ever microaggressed someone? The answer is probably yes, because we go through life and we don't, sometimes this comes from a place of ignorance, or it comes from a place of just limited experience, right? And so we do not intend to insult someone, but our cultural socialization just kind of comes out and those assumptions come out. Okay, and it's not usually something that someone's aware of. So there's I'm going to warn you, the link in the notes section of this slide has swear words and is kind of naughty, but it's really good at illustrating this point. And there's another one that I like that I'll maybe post in the section of D2L called "Where Are You From?" And you will kind of see that. Some of you may recognize that because I think it went viral a few years ago. Okay, so a microaggression that I've had expressed to me as a woman are things like, you're really smart for a girl. Or when I was in college and I was working in a manufacturing facility, I was working in the office part, and at lunch I would study because I was in college. I actually went to a community college, and one of the male chauvinist co-workers walked past and said, "Oh, what are you studying, Tanya? Underwater basket weaving?" Like, first of all, underwater basket weaving is sort of a cultural stand-in for something that's not complicated or sort of easy. And I don't really know where that comes from because honestly, underwater basket weaving or basket weaving sounds pretty freaking complicated to me. But I said to him, I said, no, Bob, I'm studying technical Japanese. And that shut him up for a while anyway. But yeah, so those are some microaggressions. And of course, mine are not as serious, right, as others that certainly folks have faced. And then what's really difficult is when you've got political leaders, using microaggressions in this current climate. Calling something the China virus is a microaggression. Okay, and we've actually seen an increase in hate crimes against Asian Americans in this current time. Okay, I'm going to pause here and then finish the rest of the slides for you in the last section. Thanks.